2. Has anyone heard the term safety 2? Yeah, a few people. That's good. Excellent. If not, then you'll soon know about it. Safety 1 is what people, I guess, are used to. Safety as a investigation. You see an RCA, an inquiry, and what's called root cause analysis, trying to find out what is the one thing that could have been fixed to prevent something going wrong. And that's kind of been the way we've done safety in the past. We look to find what thing went wrong and make sure that doesn't happen again. Safety 2 is a different way of looking at the same thing. As many of you would have seen this picture, this was from the US Navy during World War II, where they decided for the first time to systematically investigate the damage done to planes that returned from battle. And they mapped the bullet holes on planes when they landed and have found this distribution. And in those days, and still today, the decision about where to place armour was kind of a difficult one, in that the more armour a plane had, the safer it was, but the less payload it could carry, the less range it could have. So there's always a payoff or a balance between the amount of armour you've got and the capability of the aircraft. So they only wanted to put armour where the bullet holes were. So that was their thought. They should reinforce that central fuselage area, wing tips, tail. Those are the bits that get shot. We should defend those. And Abraham Wald was a mathematician working in the organisation, and he recognised something called survivorship bias. What he realised was actually the planes returning and landing were the ones who had damage to the non-important parts of the plane. And that in fact, this should be telling us that we should put the armour over the fuel tanks, in the middle of the wings, over the engines, and over the cockpit. And that makes perfect sense, because those are the parts that are a lot more likely to end in death to the crew and damage and destruction of the plane. So it's a great example of a change in thinking which dramatically altered the effect of a safety program back there in World War II. I think the current gurus of safety 2 are these two individuals, Eric Hocknagel and Sidney Dekker. Sidney Dekker is actually a US pilot who's moved to Queensland. At one point when COVID's settled, we might definitely need to invite him. But both of them have led the way over the last decade and a half in terms of changing the narrative on safety. Because I realised that Safety 1 works to a certain degree, and it has improved safety in many organisations. But in complex systems, particularly in high-level aviation, once you've removed most of the simple things, and particularly things like medicine, that there's been a plateauing of safety improvements. And that looking at things from a Safety 1 perspective is unlikely to get any better for us in terms of preventing very unusual, complex systems problems. And it's also recognised that in very human-related industries like our own, which are too complicated for robots to do, you can't automate most of what we do, that humans hold the key to safety as well as to accidents. And so that has to be thought of differently. You've all heard of crew resource management, CRM, and we've talked a bit about human factors, non-technical skills. There's been lots of talk about that, lots of training in it, lots of input from various places. And, they have been very important in improving the way we do things. But it always recognises, CRM comes from the perspective is that the human is the problem. The human makes the error. If we could remove the human, if we could train the human better, if they would work better together, then the problem would not occur. So much so that in human health safety, we talk about to err as human, which is sort of the iconic paper and report into the US on medical errors in 1999. And they basically said that about 30% of deaths in the US healthcare system were due to human error. And it was kind of a wake-up call. But since then, it's arguable that the Safety 1 approach hasn't really yielded the results that we would expected. You would also see there that there was a whole sort of safety event rates and sort of trying to compare complex systems and ideal systems. And aviation's always this kind of perfect system, or nuclear power plants, and then Formula 1 teams, and then health all the way down one end, a long way away from ideal. And the first big writers on safety were people like James Reason, who came up with the Swiss cheese model that you'll have seen before, where holes in the Swiss cheese need to line up to allow an error to go from the event all the way through to the end. And he even went to the quite detailed effort of classifying human error into these really complicated things. Unsafe acts, is it an error or is it a violation? Is it skill-based error, perceptual error? Is it a decision error? Is it routine, exceptional? And then all these other complex categorizations. And they've really not proved to be very useful, because it all depends on your perspective. And an error is only an error if you decide to stop looking for other causes and attribute the result of an accident to that one person. So error is interesting, but certainly Safety 1 has been focused on human error and error in general. But it's time for a rethink in many areas, because really the approach has been in Safety 1, find the problem, and it's almost always a person at the end, no matter what. Some person did the wrong thing or made a mistake or didn't see something, didn't understand the situation. If we can get rid of the human, replace it with robots and computers and automation, we'll have no problems. And that's worked well for aviation and has not worked at all really for medicine. In fact, it's created its own problems. In aviation, it's caused its own problems though. It's created issues where human and computer interfaces are making mistakes. An example was the most recent Boeing issues where their aircraft were crashing constantly, and that was a human-computer interface problem where they tried to automate the human out of it, and that had caused its own problems, and that led to some big accidents. But it's clear that as we speak, we cannot replace our registrar and paramedic cohort with robots. It's just not a done thing, and the overtime rates would be much better, all that sort of stuff. But it's just not going to be doable, and it's very unlikely. We're probably in the most safe world in terms of automation and AI, because it is just so complicated, the interaction between humans and systems, and particularly in pre-hospital retrieval medicine. So again, you've seen Reason's Swiss cheese model. The multiple layers represent potential or latent failure modes, and in the end, though, there's always a person. Right on the end, a person who gave the wrong dose of the drug, who cut the wrong vessel, who did the wrong thing, and that's what the focus has always been on. And then when we investigate things, we do root cause analysis, we review cases in M&M, or even learning from excellence. What we're doing is we're going back in time, but we have this massive hindsight bias, because we're standing at the end knowing the outcome, and when we look back, it seems obvious. Why did they cut the left ureter, not the right ureter? Why did they give the double dose of drugs? It's obvious to us because we have hindsight bias. And it's very important when we do investigations to remember that the people at the time were doing what made sense to them. And that's the assumption we must always make, that people come to work to do a good job, and I'm sure that is a reasonable assumption, but that things are much more complicated as you move through the universe, not when you look back. And that's often forgotten, particularly when organisations do reviews of accidents. And I see it all the time in root cause analyses. So, well, you should have recognised someone. How could no one recognise this person's got a broken arm? At the first moment. That's why they didn't get the diagnosis, and that clinician needs to be trained better, and that's an obvious reason for the injury. In medicine, you may have heard of Hadiza Bawagaba. She was a doctor who was working in an NHS hospital. She'd just returned from maternity leave, and she was confronted with a difficult case. It was a young child with Down syndrome who had sepsis. The department was very short-staffed. There was supposed to be a consultant supervising her, but was not really able to. There were multiple other patients being looked after, and this patient had a bad outcome. And medicine did as bad a job as really you can at managing this case. This person went all the way to having the medical registration removed, and then went on to be prosecuted for manslaughter in a court in the UK. Their self-reflected learnings were brought into the court case. The consultant who was supposed to be supervising them put his hands up and said, well, I had nothing to do with it, and was able to walk away, and this doctor was prosecuted. She's since had that prosecution reversed and is now back working, but only by the loud voices of very, very many people who realise that this was not a human error, this is a systems problem, a systems issue. And when you stop looking for the cause of things at the moment of the person's act, then you've stopped fixing systems and you're now persecuting humans, and that's not what we want. But the other thing that people do is they compare, aviation and aviation safety with medicine. And there are definitely things that we can and have learned from aviation, things like checklists, things like closed-loop communication, a whole host of emergency action cards and these sorts of tools. But the idea that aviation and critical care resuscitation are in any way similar is just mad. This plane has been designed from the ground up to fly and not to crash. It has multiple safety systems. In fact, nowadays, most planes take off and land without any significant input from the humans. They're flying designated routes that they've flown on many times before and can be pre-planned. There's lots of layers of safety. There's even two people who have nothing else to do except to watch all of the equipment and make sure things are going the right way. Pilots now fall asleep during their missions because there is so little to do. And the question in aviation is, what can we do to re-engage pilots because there is so little asked of them most of the time. But compare that with a typical resuscitation. We've got ad hoc crews, people who've never worked together. We have a patient who's crashing and burning. We may not know what's wrong with them. And numbers are coming thick and fast and changing rapidly. It's a completely dynamic and different situation. So, the things that aviation can teach us, I think, are quite limited. And there's this description of this sort of spectrum of complexity that goes from simple to anarchy, where sort of everyone understands what's required, and then technology is there to assist. And most of medicine lives in the complex and anarchic position. There is no technology that can completely take over from our job. And there's often not agreement on everyone's part about what needs to be done. There's no randomised control trial telling us how to do things. So we definitely exist in this complicated and anarchic universe. And the more we study complexity, we realise that there are these sorts of things, emergent phenomenon or emergent systems. And that's the concept that even within simple rules, that complexity can occur that generates things that look like they must have been man-made. So these are rocks that have been worn by the ocean and the winds into these lovely octagonal shapes. And that's simply an emergent phenomenon from very simple things, water waves. And so much so in medicine, there are emergent phenomena that occur in complicated systems. And those are maybe where the errors are occurring or where the safety systems should be looking. So, in safety 1, we were worried. We thought that accidents happen because people find ways to overcome design flaws and hindrances. They just do their own thing. They adjust their performance to match demands and conditions instead of just following their operating procedure. They interpret and apply procedures to match the situation, which is not what we told them to do. And they intervene when things look like they're going to go wrong. And that's exactly what happens when things go well. It's because exactly the same reasons. People find ways to overcome design flaws and hindrances. We pretty much could not do a day of our work without having to work around some system or complexity that hasn't been written to an operating procedure, a manual or a protocol. We also couldn't do anything well unless we adjusted our performance to match demands and conditions, or to interpret and apply procedures on the day individually on a patient that we see. And certainly we're essential to intervene when things look like they're going to go wrong. So perhaps it's not the us, it's the situation that's important. Safety 1 used to look at things like this. They'd say there's a function, which is also called work as imagined, and then a success. Nothing went wrong. That's good, perfect. Then there's a malfunction. Something went wrong, and so then there was a failure. But what we now understand is that actually everyday work, things that we do, can often have success and failure without any distinguishing feature beyond the two. And that emergent systems or emergent phenomenon from our everyday work is where the money is. And that there's maybe no difference between success and failure from the work perspective. So if you had to take away anything from this is the one slide to review. It's safety 1 has been there to look at defining safety as trying to make as few things go wrong as possible. Try and weed out all the things that go wrong. And that's good. There's nothing wrong with it. Safety 1 is important. It's also said that managements are going to be reactive. They're going to respond when something goes wrong. They're going to respond to disasters, respond to errors, respond to malfunctions. And they're going to see humans as a liability or a hazard, a risk to be managed. You're also going to say that all the accidents are caused by failures and malfunctions. That's how we're going to define them. And the purpose of an investigation is to find that cause, that root cause analysis. Find that one thing, stop that happening again, and everything will be fine. And they say that accidents, the risk assessment is of these accidents. We need to work out what these failures are. But Safety 2 looks at things quite differently. It looks at things about how many things can go right. Let's look at things that go right as well as things that go wrong. It's proactive in that it's trying to anticipate developments and events. It's not just looking at that tiny subset of things with a bad outcome. It sees humans as absolutely necessary and completely important for the resilience of complex systems. It allows systems flexibility. We also look at things that happen the same way regardless of the outcome. And that's the purpose of an investigation is to work out how things usually go right as a basis for making sure things that don't go wrong. And to understand the conditions of performance variability, because that's the sort of key where we can have some say, and that requires looking at good and bad. And it really is trying to say that these holes are not really the answer, that this is too simplistic a way of looking at things. I'll give you an example. So everyone knows the story of Sully. He was in a commercial 2-engine flight and flew into a flock of geese, which took out both engines. He was at about 3,000 feet, so only a few minutes after takeoff, so quite low. He had to make a really quick call about whether or not he was going to land back at the airport or whether he was going to ditch the plane. His co-pilot started doing the checklists for double engine failure, and there are in fact double engine failure checklists, but they're quite long and they kind of predicated on being much, much higher up in the sky. And so, for example, one thing that Sully did was he released the Ram Air power unit, which is basically a little pod that drops down and keeps the controls and the instruments working despite having no engines. But in the checklist, that's actually like right down and probably would never have had time to even get to it. So he started acting out of instinct based on his experience as a pilot, and he made a rapid decision that they weren't going to be able to land at the airport and that they were going to ditch. This is the most difficult and complicated thing a pilot can do, which is to ditch in water with a full plane load of people and fuel. But he made it, and the rest is history. He landed perfectly. Everyone managed to get off, and he was a hero. But what would have happened if Sully had crashed that plane, cartwheeled, and everyone had died? Would the investigation have gone quite so swimmingly? Or would it have said, you didn't follow procedure, you should have landed back at the airport, you took a massive risk with everyone's lives, you did the wrong thing, it's his fault, there was a checklist, you should have used the checklist, gone through the whole checklist, it would have solved the problem. I think it's really interesting to look at the perspective, because we only consider things a problem or gone wrong when we know the outcome. Does that make sense? At the time, it could have gone either way, and probably was alignable all the way up to the second they landed and stopped. So Safety 1 is focused on that little tiny things that go wrong. And they're kind of easy to look at because you can pick them out when patients die or have a bad outcome. They're kind of easy to identify. Things that are difficult to assess that go right in the middle, and then there's this sort of early completion, excellence, innovation, and the positive surprises. That's an area that hasn't really been studied much, particularly in medicine. And if you look at it from sort of how easy it is to do investigations, there's that easy to see stuff, but it is kind of often complicated etiology, and it is often difficult to change because quite often they're black swan events, 1 million, and it's kind of hard to know how to stop them ever happening again. There's this middle part that's kind of difficult to see because it's just so much of it and so much noise, and it's the 10,000 cases a year. It's not the 5 or 6 big disasters. The etiology of those and good and bad are often quite uncomplicated. There are things you can take from pretty much every case, and they're easy to manage, easy to change. And then right up the top, there's a kind of easy to see amazing saves, miracles, however you like to call them, where things go really well. And they're often we can study them. We don't necessarily find massive learning for everyone. They're difficult to make everyone get to that level, and sometimes it's a complete life. So here's the kind of idea of where Safety 1 has been focused on, that tiny little subgroup at the bottom. And Safety 2 is now focused on predominantly that middle section of everyday actions, everyday work, risks as well as opportunities. And that's been very interesting to our service as a system to try and get better. An example of kind of the challenges of rare events, black swan events, was the this platform accident. And they classically, Deepwater Horizon famously has this sign up 329 days without a reportable accident. So their safety one had been working very well, and the very next day the entire thing blows up. An example of how difficult it is sometimes with those black swan events, if you're just looking at safety one. The other thing I'm interested in is the term work as imagined and work as done, but there's also work as prescribed and work as disclosed. And from a management perspective, this is kind of what I think about and why I'm trying to be really involved in all of our governance activities, because there's what work is as imagined is. That's what the people who write the clinical practice standards or the protocols think you guys are doing out there. We understand, we think what you're experiencing, what you're seeing, how you deal with things. Then there's work as prescribed. That's what we write down in the clinical practice standard. That's what we think you should do, and based on what we know and the evidence and synthesis and expert opinion. And there's work as disclosed. It might be a little bit different in that you don't tell us everything you do. You tell us most of what you do, but maybe doing some other things when we're not looking. And that's certainly the case in many organisations. So there's a subtle creep, changes to the way people behave when management are there and when they're not. So that work as disclosed and work as imagined, you want to be as close as possible to get it in an open and just culture. And then finally, there's work as done. And if work has been done is different from work as prescribed, then there's clearly a disconnect. And we need to bring those protocols, clinical practice standards, algorithms back to alignment. And if ideally all of those could be kind of much closer, that would be better. And so much of my interest in governance is actually trying to make sure that those things mesh, that all of those types of work are actually much more similar than they might be. An example of how we do that in this organisation is we have daily coffee in cases. So this is where people are asked to discuss cases the last 24 hours or further if they're interesting. And we are literally learning from each other on the 99% of cases, not the ones that necessarily go amazingly well, the ones that go really badly, but the middle ground, the everyday work, the average case, the things that are standard work. And I think that is where gold is achieved. There's so much little 1%ers we get out of those sorts of discussions. We each learn from each other. It means that individuals can learn from the entire spectrum of experience that the organisation gets. Because as a single person, I don't get to do 24 RSIs a year and 17 major car accidents and 14 mass casualty incidents. But if I'm ringing in a coffee in cases, teleconferencing or being there, then I can get a lot more experience than I would otherwise get. And that's where we can investigate some of those things. Now, we do safety one, we do M&Ms, we do blood transfusion audits, clinical governance airway registries, but we also do learning from excellence, and we have done for quite a while. And that's trying to look at the things that go well. Is there gold to be gained from there? And I think it has been very positive for the culture of the organisation. Even if someone doesn't necessarily appear on it, it gives confidence to people that the organisation is not here to criticise, performance manage them as its major system. It's there to improve. And so if we're looking at the good as well as the bad, and if you see a case presented in M&M and in learning from excellence, then that tells you that what we're interested in, the systems learning. But clinical governance is very time-consuming. Our typical M&M takes about 40 hours of human work to develop, and multiply that by about 6 or 8 different audits done monthly. We are exerting a large amount of time and effort, but I think it's very important. I'll leave you with some further reading if you're interested in the world of safety too. The two best, so this is the best book, and then there is in fact an audio book read by Sidney Dekker in his particularly gruff American accent, which is great. And I think it's a great first intro. It's probably his seminal book in terms of for the average reader. And there's some other options there which will give you some ideas about what you might read. And I will, when we publish this on the web, those will be available.